Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the defiant slave Tobias of Georgia and the haunting mystery of his disappearance that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The air on the Vance plantation, deep in the heart of Georgia, was a palpable entity. It was always thick, heavy with the heat that shimmered above the red clay, and a hardship that clung to the soul like humidity to skin. But on this particular morning in the year 1839, the air was filled with something else entirely. A chilling mystery. An unnerving silence had fallen over the land. A quiet so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to swallow the familiar morning chorus of roosters, distant barking dogs, and the waking murmurs of the quarters. The world felt as though it were holding its breath. The only sound, carried on the faintest of breezes, was a soft, rhythmic, metallic chime, the sound of a ghostly pendulum counting the seconds of a world thrown violently off its axis. As the first fragile rays of dawn clawed through the thick, humid atmosphere, a young field hand named Samuel, on his way to the well, was the first to see it. He was a boy, barely a man, his shoulders already slumped with the familiar weight of the day to come. The alien sound made him pause, his head tilting in confusion. He followed the sound's origin with his eyes, his gaze settling upon the great oak tree that dominated the landscape. And then he froze. His wooden bucket slipped from his grasp, hitting the packed earth with a dull, forgotten thud that was absorbed instantly by the oppressive silence. There, hanging from the thickest, lowest branch, was a heavy iron chain. It swayed gently, each perfectly formed link glinting with the cold, hard light against the pearly gray sky. The chains were not on a man, a prisoner, or an animal. They hung in effigy, a horrifying, impossible spectacle. The space beneath it, where the low stool and meticulously arranged tools of the plantation's blacksmith should have been, was starkly, terrifyingly empty. Tobias Green had vanished. He had not run, leaving a trail of desperation for the hounds to follow. He had not cried out, leaving an echo of his fear to linger in the air. He had simply dissolved, leaving behind only the very symbol of his bondage, now transformed into an unanswerable question that hung heavy and menacing over every soul on the property. The news did not spread like fire, but like smoke, a silent, choking cloud of whispers that billowed through the slave quarters. Heads turned slowly, eyes wide with a mixture of raw fear and a terrifying, nascent awe. What kind of man doesn't just break his chains, but forges a new set with the skill of a master, only to leave them hanging as his final, silent statement? The sun rose higher on that fateful day, but it brought no warmth, no clarity. It only served to illuminate the birth of a legend, a chilling mystery that would be whispered in the dark for 100 years to come. To comprehend the chilling audacity of this act, to understand the ghost of a man who could turn his shackles into a testament, one must first understand the very soil from which this mystery grew. The Vance plantation was more than a plot of land. It was a meticulously managed engine of profit fueled by human suffering. An isolated kingdom carved out of the red Georgia clay. County ledgers from the period listed as one of the most productive in the region. A fact built upon the relentless, back-breaking cultivation of cotton during the height of the Antebellum boom. This was a time when cotton was king, and men like Elias Vance were its demanding, unforgiving courtiers. The air here, thick with the sweet, cloying scent of magnolias from the gardens of the big house, was a cruel mockery, a fragrant poison in a place so devoid of beauty or grace. Heat was a constant oppressor, a physical weight that pressed the very air from a man's lungs and seemed to slow time itself to a punishing crawl, stretching each day into an eternity of labor. At the center of this kingdom, both geographically and spiritually, stood the ancient oak. It was more than a tree. It was the plantation's silent, unblinking historian. Its gnarled limbs and thick trunk, scarred by lightning and the passage of a century, had stood sentinel over generations of sorrow. Local law, passed down in hushed tones among the enslaved, claimed its roots were so deep they drank from the river of tears shed by their ancestors. It had witnessed births and deaths, secret prayers and public punishments. Its deep green leaves offered the only meaningful shade in the vast, sun-scorched expanse of the plantation, a shade that felt less like a comfort and more like a temporary reprieve from the judgment of an indifferent sky. From the shaded veranda of the main house, a grand white structure that seemed to float above the misery of the fields, the world of the plantation was overseen by two very different kinds of power. The first was the architect of this suffering, Elias Vance. He was a man for whom the world was a ledger, and morality was a simple calculation of profit and loss. Every soul on his property, every cotton bale, every tool, was merely an entry in a column of assets or liabilities. He was a man of cold, profound detachment, his mind fortress of numbers, utterly insulated from the human cost of his wealth. Plantation records, penned in his neat, precise hand, documented the relentless rhythm of his enterprise, but never the silent despair of the people who powered it. His conversations, even with his overseer, rarely touched upon the people themselves, but on the price of new equipment from the north, the holding price of cotton, and the peak efficiency needed for the harvest. The second, and far more immediate, power was his overseer, a coarse, bull-necked man named Mr. Croft. If Vance was the cold architect of the system, Croft was its brutal, hands-on mechanic. His presence seemed to radiate a low-frequency brutality, a constant, simmering threat that made the air around him feel thin and dangerous. His focus was never on profit margins, which he left to Vance, but on the tangible mechanics of control, on the breaking of wills, the enforcement of fear, and the absolute, unquestioning order he imposed with the coiled leather of his whip and the cold iron of the shackles he kept in his shed. He was the force that turned Vance's cold calculations into the hot, searing reality of daily life, and his shadow fell long and dark across the fields. This was the world that had forged Tobias Green, a world of calculated cruelty and simmering violence, watched over by a silent, ancient tree that remembered everything. But this story is not truly about the men who owned the land or the man who patrolled it with violent authority. It is about the man who worked beneath its most ancient witness, in the vital, fiery heart of the plantation's operations, in the suffocating hierarchy of the Vance property. Tobias Green was an anomaly. He was, by trade and title, a slave. He was, in function, a vital asset, the blacksmith whose profound skill kept the entire operation from grinding to a halt. Plows, hinges, tools, wagon wheels, the very skeleton of the plantation's productivity was held together by the work of his hands. But in spirit, he was something else entirely. He was a quiet man, his face a mask of stoicism that betrayed nothing of the restless, churning thoughts within. His eyes, deep-set and observant, missed little. He saw everything. He saw the slight dip of a head that signaled deference, but also the flicker of resentment in the eyes that followed. He saw the quick, shared glance between fellow slaves that conveyed a volume of unspoken understanding. He saw the weariness that settled into their bones, the fear that haunted their nights, and the small, almost invisible sparks of defiance that survived in the darkest corners of their lives. His hands were a road map of his existence, etched with the white scars of burns from the forge and calloused from years of gripping hammers and tongs. Yet for all their roughness, they moved with the surgeon's care, each stroke of a file deliberate and exact, each swing of the hammer a testament to a deep, ingrained knowledge of his craft. He understood iron. He understood its strengths, its weaknesses, its breaking points. He knew how to bend it to his will. He understood patience. He understood how things fit together. And, more importantly, how they could be broken apart. This quiet, powerful man was the still point at the center of the plantation's daily storm. But in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, those who knew how to look the elders, the other artisans, his wife Sarah could sense a change. It was not in his words, for he spoke even less than usual. It was not in his work, for it remained as flawless and essential as ever. The Dao Hue Batuang, the portent of what was to come, was in his silence. A silence that was no longer just stoic or resigned, but had become something harder, something tempered in a fire hotter than his own forge. It was a silence that was becoming dangerously sharp, imbued with a cold, clear, and resolute purpose that no one, not even the ever-watchful Mr. Croft, could decipher. A flicker had ignited within the deep, observant eyes of Tobias Green, something that would soon burn brighter and more terribly than anyone on the Vance plantation could have ever imagined. That hardened silence, that new and dangerous purpose simmering behind Tobias Green's eyes like heat rising from cooling iron, did not need to wait long for a catalyst. The machinery of the Vance plantation, a relentless engine fueled by misery, was designed to produce such moments of brutal clarity. The catalyst arrived on a sweltering afternoon a week before his disappearance, a day when the sun beat down with a relentless, suffocating force. The air itself was a physical weight, shimmering above the endless rows of cotton, so thick with humidity it felt like breathing water. In the dizzying haze, a young field hand named Samuel, the same boy who would later be the first witness to the impossible, stumbled. It was a minor thing, a human error born of sheer exhaustion, as a bundle of cut sugar canes slipped from his sweat-slicked grasp and scattered in the red dust. In a sane world, it would have been nothing. But the Vance plantation was not a sane world. For Mr. Croft, whose authority was absolute and whose temper was a notoriously short fuse, there were no accidents. There were only infractions, disruptions to the relentless, brutal rhythm he imposed upon his world. He descended upon the boy like a hawk, his voice a low snarl that cut through the drone of the insects. He dragged Samuel not to the overseer's shed for a private punishment, but to the open space near the great oak, the public stage where lessons were etched not just into skin, but into the collective memory of all who were forced to watch. Tobias, having just finished sharpening the last of the hose, found himself an unwilling member of the audience. He stood by the anvil, his workplace now a gallery for this theater of cruelty, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the handle of a heavy hammer he had just set down. The tool felt cold and heavy in his hand, a stark contrast to the hot rage building within him. Croft's voice was a whip before the whip, his words lashing out with venom, dissecting the boy's character for the unforgivable crime of being tired. Then, the sound that made the very air flinch, the crack of leather against the boy's back. Once, twice, 3 times. The boy cried out, a thin, desperate sound that was swallowed by the vast, indifferent sky. A sound Tobias knew would echo in his mind for eternity. Tobias's jaw was a knot of granite. He did not look away. He forced himself to bear witness. He watched every stripe materialize, a blooming red flower of pain. He watched every shudder that racked the young man's body. His gaze was fixed, burning, absorbing the brutality until it became a part of his own marrow. In that moment, he saw not just Samuel, but the reflection of his own son, Jacob, in a potential future. He saw the system for what it was, a machine designed to grind boys into broken men. When it was over, Croft shoved the boy to the ground. "Let that be a lesson to all of you," he spat, his eyes sweeping over the other workers who had frozen in their tasks, their faces impassive masks hiding a maelstrom of emotions. As Samuel struggled to his feet, his eyes filled with tears and a shame that burned hotter than the stripes on his back. They met Tobias's. It was a fleeting connection, a spark of shared humanity in the suffocating darkness. In that shared glance, Tobias conveyed not pity, which was a useless luxury, but a shared pain, a deep and resonant anger. And in the flicker of that moment, the catalyst struck the flint. A plan, long dormant in the restless corners of his mind, ignited into an inferno of purpose. Dusk settled over the plantation, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange as if reflecting the violence of the day. The oppressive heat finally began to recede, replaced by the chirping of crickets. Tobias walked the well-worn path to his cabin, a small, windowless structure of rough-hewn logs that was both a prison and a sanctuary. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of wood smoke and the meager meal of ash cakes and water. Sarah, his wife, was preparing. She stood over the hearth, her silhouette a study in quiet strength against the flickering firelight. Her face, usually a mask of weary resilience, was etched to the constant, underlying fear for the safety of her family. Their young son, Jacob, slept soundly on a thin pallet in the corner, his small chest rising and falling in the innocent rhythm of childhood, blessedly unaware of the world of whips and chains that existed just beyond the cabin's flimsy door. This cabin was a small pocket of tenderness in a world of unrelenting hardship. Here, a man was not an asset or a tool, but a husband and a father. Sarah turned as Tobias entered, and her perceptive eyes immediately found the new tension in his shoulders, the grim set of his jaw that he could not hide from her. "The work was hard today," she said, her voice soft, her touch on his arm a gentle question that asked everything her words did not. "What happened? Are you hurt? Are you safe?" He looked from her weary, loving face to his sleeping son, and a profound weariness filled his eyes, a weariness that went far beyond physical exhaustion. "The work is always hard," he replied, his voice a low rumble. They ate in a comfortable silence, the air thick with all the things they could not say. There was no overt discussion of escape, no whispered plans of running north. The words were too dangerous, the hope too fragile to be spoken aloud and risk being crushed. But the thought of it was a constant presence, a ghost that sat at the table with them. A silent prayer in the space between their heartbeats. Tobias watched Jacob, so small, so vulnerable, and a fierce, protective love surged through him, hardening his resolve into something as unyielding as the anvil in his forge. He finished his meal, a promise forming not on his lips, but in the deepest part of his soul, a promise to the sleeping boy. A man must find his own shade. Later, when the plantation was cloaked in the deep, starless dark of a new moon, Tobias slipped out of his cabin. Sarah, lying awake, sensed his departure. She did not call out. A cold dread mixed with a strange, unspoken trust filled her heart as she listened to the sound of his footsteps fading into nothing. The world was asleep. The master's house was a dark monolith, the overseer's cottage, silent. Even the night birds seemed to hold their breath. He moved with a practiced stealth, his bare feet making no sound on the cool, damp earth as he made his way to the forge, the heart of his waking life, the place of his labor. But tonight, his work was his own. He stoked the embers, coaxing them back to life, not with the reluctant motion of a slave, but with the focused intensity of an artist approaching his masterpiece. The soft glow of the forge illuminated his face, casting his features in a grim, determined light. He was not repairing tools for the harvest. He was not mending a broken plowshare. He was creating. From a length of heavy iron rod he had secreted away weeks ago, stolen in small, imperceptible increments, he began to forge a chain. The rhythmic clang of the hammer on the anvil, a sound so common during the day, was now transformed in the dead of night. It was a sound of pure defiance, a secret language, the very heartbeat of rebellion. Each strike was a blow against his bondage. Each spark that flew from the hot metal was a rebellious thought given form. A fiery prayer for freedom. He worked meticulously, his movements economical and precise, linking one heavy, perfectly formed oval to the next. The chain grew under his powerful hands, a precise and horrifying replica of the ones used for punishment, the ones that hung in the overseer's shed. This was not merely an act of labor. It was a ritual of transformation. He was taking the very instrument of his people's oppression and recasting it, imbuing it with a new and terrible purpose. Historical accounts from the era often speak of escape, but rarely of such a profound act of symbolic warfare. He was not forging a path to freedom. He was forging a monument to the price of it. He worked until the first hint of dawn threatened the eastern sky, his face slick with sweat, his muscles aching, but his purpose as clear and as hard as the iron cooling in the quenching tub. The first light of dawn was a fragile, pearly gray that did little to cut through the thick, humid air when the impossible sight was revealed. It was Samuel, sent to the well with the memory of Croft's whip still burning on his back, who first saw it. The clinking of the chain was the only sound that seemed to matter now, a sound that cut through the morning haze and settled deep in the marrow of their bones. It was a question and a statement all at once, a sight so impossible, so audacious that it defied immediate comprehension. The sun climbed higher, turning the gray sky to a blazing blue, and the chain glinted, a diadem of defiance. "Mister!" Croft arrived like a thunderclap. He strode toward the oak, his face a mask of confusion that quickly curdled into a florid, explosive rage for a man like Croft. The world was simple, built on a foundation of fear and order. This was chaos. It was art. It was a message he couldn't decipher, and it terrified him. He saw the chain not as a mystery, but as a personal affront, a direct and insolent mockery of his authority. The very instrument of his control had been stolen, replicated, and displayed as a spectacle by the very man he considered little more than a useful tool. His thick neck reddened, and a vein pulsed at his temple. His entire sense of self, built on the illusion of absolute power, was hanging from that branch. He saw the small crowd of enslaved people frozen in their tracks, their eyes fixed on the impossible sight, and his fury boiled over into a desperate need to reassert control. "Get back to work," he bellowed, his voice cracking with a rage that bordered on panic. "All of you. This is his devilment, and I'll see him whipped for it. Find him. I want him found by noon." He jabbed a finger at two nearby men, their faces pale with fear. You and you. Get up there, cut that thing down, now! The men hesitated, their eyes darting from Croft's furious face to the ominous chain and back again. The idea of climbing the ancient tree, of touching that chain, felt like a trespass on something sacred and dangerous. It felt like dismantling a sign. Did you hear me? Croft took a menacing step forward. Now. Scrambling, one of the men boosted the other into the lower branches. He climbed awkwardly, his hands shaking as he pulled out a small hatchet. The metallic clang as he struck the chain echoed across the unnaturally quiet plantation, each blow a punctuation mark in the unfolding drummer. It sounded less like work and more like desecration. Finally, a link broke, and the chain fell to the ground with a heavy, final crash. It lay coiled in the dust like a dead snake, its power seemingly gone. But its image, hanging proud and silent in the morning light, was already burned into the mind of everyone who had seen it. The act was done. The secret had been revealed. And for Croft, his face still a thunderous mask as he stormed away from the tree, the hunt for a man had become a war against a ghost. The hunt began not with the cold logic of a tracker, but with the hot, blustering fury of a humiliated man whose authority had been publicly challenged by an act of impossible defiance. Croft, his face a thunderous mask, did not turn toward the swamps or the forests first. His singular purpose, his absolute destination, was the small, rough-hewn cabin where Tobias lived with his family. He marched directly there, his heavy boots kicking up clouds of red dust, each step a hammer blow against the earth. He kicked the flimsy door open, the wood groaning in protest as it slammed against the interior wall. Revealing a scene of terrified domesticity, Sarah was inside, clutching Jacob to her chest, her body a pillar of terrified dignity. She had heard the shouting, had seen the commotion from the crack in her door, and a cold, paralyzing dread had taken root in her stomach. Now, that dread had a name and a face, and it filled the tiny space of her home, sucking the very air from the room.
Where is he?
Croft snarled, his eyes scanning the cabin as if expecting to find Tobias hiding under the single cot. He was not asking a question. He was making a demand, an assertion of his right to know, to possess, to control every secret within his domain. He tore the thin blanket from the pallet, throwing it to the floor. He kicked over the small, rickety table, sending the tin cups and plates scattering with a clatter that made Jacob flinch and bury his face deeper into his mother's dress. Where did he go? Woman, did he speak of the north? Did he have help? Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She genuinely knew nothing of a plan, nothing of a destination. All she knew was the deep, hollow ache of his absence, the cold space in the bed beside her when she woke. But she also knew, with an instinct born of a lifetime of survival, that any sign of weakness, any hint of knowledge, would be a weapon in Croft's hands. She held Jacob tighter and met the overseer's glare. Her voice, when it came, trembled, but it did not break. He spoke of his work, she said, her words clear and deliberate, a small hard stone of truth offered up to a raging bull. He spoke of his son. He is my husband. That is all I know. Croft's face contorted. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her, but she did not flinch. For a long, silent moment, he stared at her, searching for the lie, for the flicker of deception in her eyes that would betray her. He found only a deep, unyielding terror, and beneath it, a strength he could not comprehend and therefore could not break. With a final, frustrated roar, he swept his arm across the mantel, sending the few meager possessions a small bird Tobias had carved from a piece of scrap wood. a smooth river stone Jacob had found crashing to the floor. He stormed out, leaving Sarah shaking in the wreckage of her home. The silence broken only by her son's frightened sobs. The first stage of the hunt had yielded its evidence, a wall of silence he could not breach. The search party that followed was a brutal farce. It was not an organized attempt to find a missing man, but an exercise in intimidation, a loud and violent reassertion of control for the benefit of the audience left behind on the plantation. Croft gathered a handful of other white men from the plantation and neighboring farms, men who shared his view of the world and his thirst for righteous violence. They set off on horseback, a chaotic and undisciplined mob fueled by whiskey and indignation. Their shouts echoed through the cypress swamps and pine forests that bordered the Vance property. Their dogs, a mix of hounds and curs, barked and bayed, their noise a violent intrusion into the quiet wilderness. They crashed through the undergrowth, trampling delicate ferns and startling birds from their nests, their horses' hooves churning the soft earth into mud. It was a search designed to be seen and heard, a performance of power. But as the slaves in the fields were forced to listen to this clumsy, angry smashing against the landscape, a different image was already forming in their collective mind. It was the image of Tobias moving through these same woods. They pictured him moving not with noise, but with silence. They imagined his bare feet finding purchase on moss and stone, his body slipping between the ancient trees like a shadow, his senses alive to the subtle language of the forest, while Croft's men shouted and cursed at the unseen wilderness. They imagined Tobias listening to the snap of a twig, the call of a specific bird, becoming a part of the landscape, not an invader. This imagined journey stood as a powerful counter-narrative, a testament to a different kind of knowledge, a different kind of power. By late afternoon, the searchers returned, their horses lathered, their faces flushed with frustration and drink. They had succeeded only in terrorizing the landscape. The irrefutable evidence they had gathered was the complete and utter lack of it. Not a footprint, not a broken branch, not a single sign that a man had passed that way. The forest had held its peace. The earth had kept its secrets. It was as if the ground itself had conspired to erase the trail of the man who sought his freedom upon it. The silence that answered Croft's violent inquiry was the loudest evidence of all. He was hunting a man far more clever and capable than he had ever imagined. That evening, as a deep, velvety darkness settled over the slave quarters, a darkness thick with unspoken questions and the lingering shock of the day's events, a small group gathered in the shadows behind old man Josiah's cabin. Josiah was an elder whose eyes held the memory of generations. He had seen more than any man present, had witnessed births and deaths, sorrows and the fleeting, desperate joys that flickered in the darkness of their lives. He had been quiet all day, watching, listening, letting the story settle in his mind. Now, he was ready to give it a voice. His own voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, resonant hum, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "That tree," he began, his gaze fixed on the distant, massive silhouette of the oak against the star-dusted sky. "That tree has seen 1,000 sorrows. It has seen the whip, and it has seen the rope. Its roots drink from soil that holds the tears of our mothers and the blood of our fathers." The small group leaned in, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of a single shielded lantern. "Tobias," Josiah continued, his voice gaining a quiet, certain power. He knew that. He knew that tree was a witness. What he did this morning, it was not just the act of a man running for his life. You see, that ain't the whole of it. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He didn't just run from the chains. He turned them back on this place. He took the very thing they used to bind us, the very symbol of our sorrow, and he hung it in the sky for all to see. A murmur of profound understanding went through the group. Josiah's words were shaping their raw fear and confusion into something new, something with meaning and power. This was not a confession of a crime, but the unveiling of a truth, a revelation of purpose. He didn't leave a trail of footprints for them to follow, the old man concluded. His voice dropped into a near whisper, a sound that carried more weight than any shout. He left a warning for any who pass under those branches, a warning that a man's spirit can't be held, even if his body is. In the quiet that followed, the empty space beneath the oak tree no longer felt like a simple absence. It felt like a presence. The legend of Tobias Green, the man who vanished and left his chains behind as a sermon forged in iron, had taken its first breath. Weeks bled into a month, and the raw, gaping wound of Tobias's disappearance began to scar over, forming the strange and varied tissue of legend. On the Vance plantation, a tense and watchful silence had replaced the initial shock, but beyond its borders, the story had sprouted legs and was beginning to run. In the nearby town, where farmers and merchants gathered to trade goods and gossip, the tale was a source of morbid curiosity. At the Saturday market, amidst the drone of flies and the murmur of commerce, two farmers leaned against a wagon wheel. Heard Elias Vance lost one of his blacksmiths. The first, a practical man named Jeb, said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Just up and ran off. Costly, I'd wager. The second farmer, a younger man with wider, more superstitious eyes, shook his head slowly. That ain't the half of it. Jeb, my wife's cousin, she does sewing for Mrs. Vance sometimes. She says they found chains, heavy ones, hanging right from that big old oak tree, just hanging there, empty, like some kind of voodoo curse. Jeb scoffed, though he couldn't hide a flicker of interest. Voodoo, that's slave nonsense. The man ran, that's all. Probably got caught in a swamp. But the younger man insisted, his voice low. She said the place has a bad feel to it now. Said the other slaves won't hardly go near that tree. They whisper about it. They say he didn't run from the chains. He left them as a sign. A curse on the whole place. The story was already morphing in the mouth of the white community, twisting from a calculated act of defiance into a dark and primitive ghost story. A piece of local folklore to be whispered with a delicious shiver of fear. But the story had another life, a more powerful one, that grew along the hidden waterways and secret paths of the enslaved community. It traveled from plantation to plantation, carried by a field hand sent on an errand, a cook visiting her sister, a preacher traveling his circuit. One evening, under the cloak of a moonless sky, a group gathered by the slow-moving Flint River for a baptism. A sacred ritual practiced in defiance of masters who feared any form of independent gathering. After the last soul had been brought up from the water, an old man from a neighboring plantation began to tell the story, his voice raspy with age. It was Josiah's version, passed to him through a chain of whispers, and it had already gained power in the telling. They say the overseer, his rage was a storm, ye could tease, the old man recounted. He had them cut down, but you cannot cut down a sign from God. A chorus of low amens rippled through the crowd. Tobias, he was a man of iron and spirit. He took their chains, the very symbol of our sorrow, and he offered them up to the heavens. He made that place of pain into a holy place in their hearts. The oak was thus redefined, no longer a stage for punishment, but a sacred altar to the spirit of defiance. Tobias was no mere runaway. He was a figure of mythic power, a man who had wrestled with the devil of bondage and vanished, leaving a promise in his place. This spiritual fervor, however, did not reach the cold, formal dining room of the Vance house. There, the story was a source of profound irritation and embarrassment. The servants are spooked. Elias, his wife said, her voice thin. They talk in whispers. It's most unsettling. Vance slammed his fork down, the sound making his wife jump. It's a financial loss is what it is. A valuable piece of property has vanished, and now my entire operation is disrupted by this superstitious nonsense. I was at the market today and heard men talking, not about my loss, but about curses and hauntings. It reflects badly on me. His concerns were not for the morale of his workforce, but for his reputation among his peers, for the neat and orderly columns of his mental ledger. He turned his cold gaze on Mr. Croft. This has gone on long enough. I want this foolishness to stop. I want the name Tobias forgotten on this plantation by the end of the week. Is that understood? Croft, his own authority already feeling the sting of the pervasive legend, nodded sharply. Yes, sir. I'll put an end to it. But just as Croft began his new campaign of suppression, a new and far more dangerous piece of information arrived at the plantation, not through the whispers of slaves, but through the casual conversation of a free man. A traveling merchant named Silas, a purveyor of goods and gossip, sat on the veranda with Elias Vance, sharing a glass of whiskey. Vance, still sore, complained about the loss of his blacksmith. Vanished, you say? Silas mused, his eyes lighting up. A blacksmith. That's a strange coincidence. I was up in the Piedmont of South Carolina just a few weeks back. The talk in one town was about a runaway they'd seen. A big man, they said, with watchful eyes, a blacksmith by trade, and a master at it. He wasn't alone. He was traveling with a Quaker, a known abolitionist man named Seth Macy. They were heading north, moving fast. In the background, a house slave named Elizabeth, refilling their glasses, did not let her hand tremble. Her face remained a perfect, placid mask of servitude, but her ears burned, and her heart began a frantic, silent drumbeat. She had heard, and she knew this was not just news. It was a revelation that would change everything. The air on the Vance plantation in Georgia was always thick, but on a particular morning in 1839, it was filled with a chilling mystery. An unnerving silence had fallen, broken only by a faint, metallic chime. As dawn broke, a young field hand froze, his bucket falling to the earth. There, hanging from the lowest branch of the great oak tree, was a heavy iron chain. It swayed in the breeze, an impossible spectacle. The space beneath it, where the plantation's blacksmith worked, was starkly empty. Tobias Green had vanished, leaving behind only the very symbol of his bondage, transformed into a haunting question. To understand this act, one must understand the Vance plantation, an isolated kingdom of calculated cruelty. It was ruled by Elias Vance, a man who saw human souls as entries in a financial ledger, and enforced by his overseer, Mr. Croft, a brutal man who found satisfaction in the mechanics of control. At the center of this world stood the ancient oak, a silent witness to generations of suffering. And beneath that tree worked Tobias, a quiet, observant man whose skill with iron was unmatched. He was a master of his craft, his stoic face a mask for a restless, churning mind. In the weeks before his disappearance, a change had come over him, a hardening of his silence, a new and dangerous purpose simmering in his eyes. The catalyst came one sweltering afternoon. A young slave named Samuel stumbled from exhaustion, a minor infraction that Croft chose to make an example of. He dragged the boy to the oak and whipped him. Tobias was forced to watch, his knuckles white on the handle of a hammer. He did not look away. He absorbed every crack of the whip, every shudder of the boy's body. in a fleeting glance between them. A look not of pity, but of shared, resonant anger. A plan long dormant in Tobias's mind ignited. That night, after a silent meal with his wife Sarah and their sleeping son Jacob, Tobias slipped out into the starless dark. He moved with practiced stealth to the forge. This time, his work was his own. He stoked the embers and began to create, from a hidden length of iron. He forged a chain, a precise and horrifying replica of the ones used for punishment. The rhythmic clang of his hammer was not the sound of labor, but the heartbeat of rebellion in the dead of night. Each strike was a blow against his bondage, each spark a fiery prayer. He worked until dawn, his purpose as hard as the iron cooling in the quenching tub. The discovery of the chain sent a shockwave of fear and awe through the slave quarters. For Mr. Croft. It was not a mystery, but a personal, insolent mockery of his authority. "Find him," he bellowed, his face a mask of explosive rage. He ordered the chain cut down, and it fell to the dust with a heavy, final crash, but its image was already burned into the mind of everyone who had seen it. Croft's hunt began immediately at Tobias's cabin. He kicked the door in, terrorizing Sarah and Jacob. "Where is he?" he snarled. But Sarah, clutching her son, met his fury with a wall of quiet strength. "He is my husband," she said, her voice trembling but unbroken. "That is all I know." Thwarted, Croft left to organize his search party. The search was a brutal farce, an exercise in intimidation rather than a genuine attempt to find a man. Croft and a mob of armed men on horseback crashed loudly and angrily through the surrounding forests and swamps, their dogs barking, their shouts echoing. They found nothing, not a footprint, not a broken branch. The irrefutable evidence was the complete absence of a trail, as if the forest itself had conspired to protect one of its own. That evening, in the deep shadows of the slave quarters, an elder named Josiah gathered a small group and gave voice to their confusion. "He didn't just run from the chains," Josiah explained, his voice a low resonant hum. "He turned them back on this place. He took the very thing they used to bind us, and he hung it in the sky for all to see. He left a warning that a man's spirit can't be held, even if his body is." In that moment, fear was transformed into meaning. The legend of Tobias Green had taken its first conscious breath. The story soon escaped the plantation's borders, morphing as it traveled in the white community. It became a superstitious ghost story of voodoo and curses, but along the secret paths of the enslaved community, it became a sermon of hope. It was told at secret baptisms by the river, transforming Tobias into a mythic figure who had wrestled with evil and ascended, making the oak tree a holy place. This growing legend was a source of profound irritation for Elias Vance. It was a disruption to his orderly world, a stain on his reputation. The final straw came when a traveling merchant named Silas shared a piece of gossip. A blacksmith matching Tobias's description had been seen weeks earlier, 100 miles north, in the company of a known Quaker abolitionist named Seth Macy. In the background, a house slave named Elizabeth overheard every word, her heart beginning a frantic, silent drumbeat. The news traveled through the plantation's whisper network and ignited a firestorm in Sarah's heart, a volatile mixture of fierce hope and a new, sharper terror of his recapture. For Vance, the news was a declaration of war. An organized abolitionist network was a threat to his entire system. He spared no expense and hired the most feared slave catcher in the South Finch. Finch arrived at dusk, a tall, lean man with eyes like chips of winter sky and two silent, lethal hounds. He was the antithesis of Croftgold, methodical and patient. He investigated the forge and the cabin before finally questioning Sarah. His inquiries like surgical knives, but he found the same unbreachable wall of silence. Finch hunted for months, following the trail north, but the abolitionist network was a ghost he could not catch. He returned to the Vance plantation in defeat. "Your man is gone," he told Vance, his voice a flat monotone. "I am the best, which means no one will find him now." Finch's failure cemented the legend. If even Finch couldn't find him, Tobias was truly beyond the reach of mortal men. This defeat sent Mr. Croft into a downward spiral of paranoia and alcoholism, haunted by his own impotence for Sarah. It brought a strange peace. The sharp terror of recapture was gone, replaced by a quiet, enduring hope that he was free. She began to shape his legacy for their son, Jacob, telling him not a story of a man who ran away, but of a man who was brave. Vance, unchanged, simply wrote Tobias off as a financial loss and bought a new blacksmith. Nearly 3 decades passed. The Civil War came and went, and the Vance plantation fell into ruin, swallowed by nature. One day in the late 1860s, an elderly Sarah and her grown, free son Jacob returned. Amidst the decay, the great oak tree stood, larger and more majestic than ever, a living monument to survival. Sarah reached out and found a small, smooth scar on the underside of a branch, the only physical evidence of that fateful morning. As they stood there, a wagon carrying a free black family passed by on the road. The father pointed to the tree. "You see that tree, children," he said, his voice full of warmth. "That's the Tobias tree. They say a long time ago, a blacksmith vanished from right here, but he left his chains hanging from that branch as a promise that we'd all be free one day." A profound peace settled over Sarah. Hearing the story on the lips of a stranger, a story that had grown so much larger than her personal grief, she understood. His true destination was never a place on a map. His victory was not in arriving, but in leaving. He had transformed himself into a symbol, an idea of freedom that could never be captured. He had become a story, and the story had done its work. She looked at her son, Jacob, standing tall and straight beside her. He was the promise fulfilled. The mystery of what happened to Tobias Green remained, but for Sarah and for history, his story was finally, beautifully complete.